This past week, we had a funeral for someone in my extended family, and I couldn't make it in person, but I watched the live stream. So I was watching it from home, with myself and Edna and Pauline. And Edna didn't know what a funeral was, so we had to explain to her that someone had died. And Edna asked why, and we explained this person was very old and she got sick. And then Edna said, "Oh, it's kind of like grandma's friend." And Edna went on to think out loud, sometimes people get married, sometimes people die, sometimes people don't die. And I'm like thinking, my goodness, I'm really glad I didn't take her in person, because this conversation is going all the wrong places. But then Edna asked, why do people die? I think sometimes it takes a child to ask a question like this because they don't realize how awkward this topic can be sometimes. But it's a good question. Or to frame this question in a Christian way, we can ask, why has God made the world in such a way that people have to die? Which is another form of a much more famous question: why does a good God allow for suffering in the world? So it's a common question. It's a very important question. People have to know this question because they're trying to resolve this conflict in their mind between a God of love and a God who almost seems to inflict suffering on people on purpose. We also need to understand this for ourselves, because sooner or later we're going to go through hard times, and it really helps us to know why we are suffering. So our big idea today is that God makes us suffer in the short term so he can satisfy us in the long term. And my goal today is to show you this idea from a Bible passage and explain to you some of the ways that this idea can work in our lives in a practical way. So now I'll just read to you the first half of our Bible passage from Psalm 90, verses 1 to 12. Nice. Psalm 90, verses 1 to 12. A prayer of Moses, the man of God. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. You sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. We're consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All of our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years, or 80 if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So that based on this passage, my first point is that God makes us suffer in the short term. There's a meme circulating around the internet. A guy text messages a girl and says, I like you. Do you like me? Girl responds back and says, no. And guy gives a sad face. And girl says, you never asked if I loved you. Guy says, aw, do you love me? Girl says, no. I laughed really hard when I first read that. It is really mean, though. And I'm really glad that I'm not that guy. But unfortunately, life is a bit like that sometimes. It can feel unnecessarily cruel. Sometimes it can feel like we are the victim of a bad joke. And sometimes it can feel like God is just inflicting pointless suffering on us. But our Bible passage teaches us that there's actually a very good reason for our suffering. Psalm 90 takes us back to the beginning of the Bible, back to the time when God created the world, made everything good. He made this Garden of Eden, and he put in the Garden of Eden this tree of life so that Adam and Eve could eat from that tree and live forever. But then Adam and Eve messed up. They couldn't trust God. And so they ate from the other tree with the forbidden fruit. And they had to face God's judgment. And I'll read to you what God said to Adam from Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 to 19. To Adam he said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." So our main passage actually quotes these verses in Psalm 90, verse 3. Psalm writer says to God, "You turn people back to dust," saying, "Return to dust, you mortals." Some versions of the Bible say at the last part, "Return to dust," or "Return children of Adam," or "descendants of Adam." And that is actually a literal translation from the Hebrew. And this verse reminds us that we are children of Adam. And just like Adam, we have a problem. Our problem is that we are mortal. We might live for 70 years or 80 years. But even in that time, even the best years are kind of painful. And that's the judgment of God for sin. But actually, God has a really good reason for making us suffer like this. And we see it in verse 12. Verse 12 is the center of the psalm. Everything hinges on verse 12. It tells us the point of our suffering. It says, "Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." So here's the point. Suffering makes us think about our mortal condition. It makes us remember that life is short and painful and unsatisfactory. And when we think about these things, we get a chance to gain wisdom. What wisdom is there? Well, in the first verse of our psalm, we see a little bit of that wisdom where it says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations, our home." We are like prodigal sons who have turned our back from home. And we're suffering partly because of that. But there is a wisdom that is more precious than people could imagine. A wisdom that solves the problem of death and solves the problem of every bad thing that has ever happened. This wisdom comes from going back home to God, which leads me to my second point. God wants to satisfy us in the long term. Years ago, I was in Florida with some classmates. We were just taking a trip. We decided to go to a theme park. So we were walking around this theme park, and we stopped at a concession stand. It was a hot day. This Florida sun was just beating down on us. I would have loved to have a nice cold drink, but I looked at the price of water over there. It was like $4 for like a bottled water. It's like $4 too. I was just like, no, that's a ripoff. There's no way I'm going to buy this water. But I looked around the concession stand, and they were selling other things. They were selling these like big doughy pretzels for about $2 each. And I thought, that's not a bad deal at all. So I bought myself a pretzel and started eating it. And I realized this pretzel was really salty. Like, I looked at this pretzel. There's more salt in this than I've ever seen in any pretzel. I figured, I could just scrape it off, I suppose, but it would kind of be messy and be kind of awkward. So I figured, all right, I'm in America. I'll just eat like the Americans. And so, I started eating this super salty pretzel, and I started going on my way, took a few steps away from the concession stand, and I realized I was super thirsty. Because all that salt made me thirsty, and I was like, no, it's a trap. And so I had to go back to the concession stand and buy the most expensive bottle of water ever. I was so mad. That concession guy probably knew all along that if I just bought that pretzel, I'd have to come back for the water anyway. That's why the pretzel was cheap and the water is expensive. But at that point, the water was just irresistible. I had to buy it. And I share this story because I think God is a little bit like the concession stand guy. when he makes us mortal and when he makes this world broken, it's like salt that we have to eat. And all this brokenness stirs in us a desire for our thirst to be quenched. As it turns out, there's only one place to satisfy this thirst. There's only one person who can help us. It's God himself. And if we would turn to God, we would find that he's not just another good thing to add to our lives, but he is the very water of life. He is a spring of living water from which we can drink and be satisfied forever. And so in the second half of this psalm, the writer turns to God and he asks for a solution for all the difficulties of life. So I'll just read to you from verses 13 to 17. It says, "Relent, Lord. How long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as you have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands." So the first word I highlighted there is really interesting. It's the word relent. It's otherwise translated return. And if you could read Hebrew, you've seen this verse before, this word before earlier on in the psalm, back in verse 3, where God says to people, "Return to dust, sons of men," or sons of Adam. So in verse 3, God tells people to return to dust. But now in verse 13, people are telling God to return, asking him, pleading with him to return. Return back to his way of kindness. Give us back the Garden of Eden. Turn back the clock. Make things right again. Give us lives full of meaning and purpose again. The psalm writer admits there's a kind of joy and fulfillment that can only come from God. Only God can give us a lasting legacy. The psalm writer also realizes that he has nothing to bargain with. He's just a sinner under judgment, and so he appeals to the mercy of God and the grace of God. And this is wisdom, to go home to God and to trust him to be good to us. Because the Bible tells us that God is full of compassion and mercy and grace, and he loves to be good to people. He wants to help us. He wants to give us the things that last forever, the things that make us happy in the long run. So I've been praying for God to make me happy like that, happy with the kind of joy that this world cannot give me. And I believe that God is actually in the process of answering this prayer in a very concrete way. And so I want to tell you about it, and I actually want to invite you into this. But first of all, I just want to give you a bit of background. So one of my duties at church is to write a children's ministry lesson every week. And for the past 2 years, I've been writing these interactive lessons, these interactive sermons, more like, for kids. And so the content is very much similar to a Sunday sermon, except we simplify the language, and instead of stories, we play games, and it keeps it fun. But the quality of the teaching is about as good as what the adults get. And the children are learning pretty much all the big ideas that the adults are. And so I'm very proud of what we're doing at Kids Club. We're grateful for all the volunteers and staff who have made Kids Club happen. But the reason why I've taken it upon myself to write these lessons is because I can't find anything like it. Like, most people just go and buy something off the shelf, but the stuff off the shelf is terrible. I'm talking about bad quality Bible study that's super unreliable, off base, just misses the entire meaning of the Bible. I'm talking about inadequate presentations of the gospel, boring activities. A lot of times, a teacher has to rewrite the whole lesson, which burns out the teacher. But churches just keep buying this stuff because they have nothing better to buy. So I've been sharing this curriculum with other churches. The response has been really excellent. And more I've come to believe that there's nothing else out there that's like this. There's practically nobody who takes care of our children like we do. And so my plan this year is to build a better curriculum. I want to build a 3 or 4 year series of lessons for kids, and it'll be really useful for our church because we can cycle through it indefinitely, and so it'll just set us up for the long run. But more importantly, I want to put the stuff on a website, and actually a prototype of the website has already been built. It's functional already, and so it has a tutorial, has some instructions, has some background information, it has access to all of the lessons that I've written. And this year, I want to work on improving this body of lessons. I want to make it more fun, more complete, just easier to use. I want to make the website better and more beautiful. Elvis is going to be working on graphics and maybe an animation or two. And by the time we're done at the end of the year, this curriculum is going to be just better in pretty much every way, vastly better than anything else that people can buy. And my hope is that churches will love this, that they'll love it so much that they'll be sharing it with other churches, and so we'll have churches that share with churches, that share with still more churches, and my hope is to have this kind of viral movement so that we can reach 1,000 churches this way, tens of thousands of children. And if we do that, we'll actually explain the gospel properly to thousands of children, and we teach them the joy of following Jesus. We'll be equipping teachers, preventing burnout, stabilizing churches, and we'll be impacting eternity in a huge way. So I've run this plan by the board. They've given their full support. But in order for me to work on these lessons, it will take me a lot of time, and I'll need to step back from a lot of my normal responsibilities. And so the biggest change that you'll notice this year is that I won't be preaching very much at all, but as much as I can every month, I'll be asking a guest speaker to come in, the best that I can find in Calgary, and they'll be subbing in for me this year. I'll also be less able to help out around the church, and so I'll be needing to lean on you guys. Lean on you to take care of each other and keep contributing in all the ways that you are. Keep taking ownership of your part of the church. And I'll still be here. I'll still do whatever the church needs. But the more I can lean on you guys, the better this resource will be for other churches and the more impact we'll make. So our Bible passage teaches us to ask God for greater things. I believe this project reflects the wisdom of this passage. So this year we'll be asking God for something that's greater. And we'll be asking not just with our words, but also with our life. And that's the kind of prayer that God honors. I'll conclude by summarizing everything I've said. I'll pray for us. So our big question today is, why does a good God allow suffering in the world? And our answer that we saw in our psalm is that God makes us suffer in the short term so he can satisfy us in the long term. Wisdom tells us that he's the answer for our suffering. And we get this wisdom by this thirst, this drive for a solution. And if we find him, we'll find that he's the answer for death, all the brokenness in the world. We'll find that he is our home. He's the only one who can make us happy. He's the only one who can give us a truly lasting legacy. And so our psalm teaches us to ask him for the things that last forever. So we ask him with our words, and we ask him with our life. And he will give us everything that we need, because he is good. Let's pray to close. God, you have made us mortals. Our lives are difficult, but short, but you are leading us to you, to give us the wisdom that we need so that we would turn to you. Give us the solution for death and brokenness, and out of the goodness of your heart, give us the things that last forever, for your glory and for our joy. Amen.